Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for the fourth in our Women of Sefarad webinar series. My name is Michael Steinberger, and I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a platform dedicated to promoting the story of Sefarad to the world at large. Our alliance brings together global organizations, institutions, and individuals covering the private and public sectors, thereby creating a voice of the collective, allowing us to broaden our scope and expand our reach. Before we get started, I would like to thank today's co-hosting partners for helping us make this event a success. I would like to thank Fundación Hispano-Judaya, or the Hispanic Jewish Foundation. I would like to thank Anu Museum, the Jewish people, previously Berat Fusot, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, American Sephardi Federation and its Institute of Jewish Experience. Special warm welcome to the Hadassah Brandeis Institute of Brandeis University, our newest member. Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies, the Feldenkrais Program in Judaic Studies, University of Miami. Centro de Estudios Judaicos de Strasmondes, European Jewish Community Center, and Kulanu. Thank you all. For those who may be joining us for the first time or may not recall, allow me to define some of the words and terminologies you will hear during today's presentation. The word Sefarad refers to Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. It is believed that the Jews first arrived in the Iberian Peninsula as early as biblical times, but the earliest archaeological proof dates to the 4th century. Jewish life in Spain ends abruptly with the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and 5 years later from Portugal. Life for the Jews living in the Iberian Peninsula was challenging, a period I often dubbed the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good resides in the periodic intervals termed the Golden Age, during which times the Jews were accepted in the local societies of the period, wherein Jewish religious, cultural, and economic life flourished. The bad resides in the repeated periods of oppression, persecution, leading to the massacres, forced conversions, and Inquisition, and finally to expulsion. The forced conversions created the converso phenomenon. In today's discussion, you will hear terms such as conversos, moranos, crypto-Jews, and new Christians, all of which collectively describe the Jews that were converted to Christianity. Moranos and crypto-Jews tend to be synonymous. Both refer to Jews that were converted to Christianity, but try to hold on to their Jewish traditions in secret. The word Morano is deemed to be derogatory, possibly meaning pig or swine, so we try not to use that term, and instead we refer to them as Bnei Anusim, which in Hebrew means descendants of the coerced. New Christians is what the church called the converted Jews to distinguish them from the old Christians. Converso tends to be the catch-all phrase for all of the above. It is important to note that when discussing conversos or crypto-Jews, we are speaking of their descendants. And now I have the privilege to introduce today's moderator, our very own Dr. Isaac Amon, Director, Academic Research and Program Development at Jewish Heritage Alliance. Take it away, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be around the globe. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. As the moderator for today's fascinating webinar, I will introduce the presenters, and following their presentations, for those in the audience who wish to stay on, we will have a question and answer session. Please post questions in the chat or preferably the Q&A box, and I will do my best to get to as many as I can. Please indicate which panelist, if any, the questions are directed towards or if they're meant for everyone. Before we begin, just a brief introduction to today's topic. Following the 1492 Edict of Expulsion and 1497 forced conversions in Portugal, Jewish communal institutions in the Iberian Peninsula were dismantled. There were no more synagogues, study halls, ritual objects, or prayer books. The guardian of Jewish traditions thus became the home. The Iberian Inquisition recognized that the women of Sefarad, as mothers and daughters, presented a serious and ongoing challenge to the church as they attempted to preserve and pass on their ancestral faith, customs, and traditions despite the threat of trial and being burnt at the stake. Accordingly, they became the primary target of the Inquisition and its pathological obsession to eradicate crypto-Judaism. Notwithstanding this grave peril to life and limb, Crypto-Jewish women, in particular, maintain their ancestral legacy by transmitting familial traditions, memories, and practices to the next generation. Today, we pay tribute to these extraordinary heroines and celebrate their bravery, courage, and perseverance across great expanses of time and space. I have the honor of introducing today's presenters, beginning with our keynote speaker, Professor Gretchen Starr-Lebeau, who is the Jean and George Todd Professor of Religious Studies at Principia College. Her research addresses the interactions of Christians, conversos, and Jews around the world between the 15th and 17th centuries. Dr. Starr-Lebeau has published on individuals tried by the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions and on the experiences of conversa and crypto-Jewish women. Gretchen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Isaac. And Michael, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I'm excited to be a part of this great series of webinars for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's great to support an organization that's providing so much good and interesting programming about the Sephardic world. And in addition, these are women about whom it's really important to know more. I'm excited to be able to talk about Sephardic women in particular. As we get started, I just want to emphasize again, the range of experiences that Sephardic women had, the extreme extent of their participation in life all around the globe, the kinds of challenges they faced, and the efforts they made to protect themselves, the efforts they made to protect their families, the efforts they made to protect, preserve, and even promote their faith. It truly was a global experience. Sephardic women, as we can see on this map, extended everywhere from the Netherlands to Italy, from Mexico to India. And it was also a complex and really disparate religious climate as Sephardic women navigated conflicting expectations and conflicting obligations that came not only from their communities and their friends, but even from within their own families. What we're looking at here is a map that shows us the extent also of Inquisition and Protestant investigatory tribunals all across the planet. I wanted to give you just a quick overview of today's presentation as we're getting started. I'll start off just by giving you a little bit more context to fill in some of the gaps from the introduction about where these women came from and some of the challenges in their lives. And then next, for most of the presentation, I want to tell you a bit about three women in particular. They, to me, exemplify the heroic behavior of so many Sephardic women between the 15th and the 17th centuries, that is, up until from the late 14 to the 1600s. The first is a woman named Benvenita Abravanel. She was a Spanish Jewish refugee who fled initially to Portugal and then ended up in Italy in the mid 1500s. Secondly, we'll be talking about a woman named Isabel de Carvajal. She lived initially in Portugal and eventually settled in Mexico at the end of the 1500s. And she gives us an example of the dangers of promoting her Jewish practices at the frontiers of the Spanish Empire in Mexico. Finally, we'll finish up by talking about a woman who lived in the middle of the 1600s, Menthia de Almeida, and not only her heroism and resilience, but the kind of ambiguity of her position over 150 years after that forced conversion of Jews in Spain. Although these women lived in very different places and times, and the circumstances and outcomes of their lives were quite different, all of them in their intelligence, their resourcefulness, and their resilience, all of these women sought to preserve their families and their faith against really difficult odds. And actually, more often than we might expect, they succeeded even in their conflicts in being brought before the Inquisition. And this picture, just so people know, is from a book from the end of the 1500s. depicting dress. This is a woman supposedly from Antwerp, a city that had a lot of crypto-Jewish families in it. So you heard a few minutes ago about the waves of persecution and conversion that happened in Spain starting in 1391 and extending all the way to 1492 in Spain and even 1499. This was a very complex situation. Families were facing a number of really conflicting pressures, and they responded in different ways, even within individual families. So some families strategically had some parts of their family convert to Christianity, while other parts of the family remained Jewish. And it seems that that was a conscious choice that they were making in some cases to preserve options and resources in an increasingly constrained and difficult environment. Some families converted, were forced to convert, reconciled themselves to that conversion. Other families converted superficially, but continued to practice Judaism in secret. And as Isaac mentioned, women were integral to that practice, since it wasn't synagogue practice, but domestic practice in the home. And then in some other cases, families absolutely resisted any attempt at conversion whatsoever. The person we're looking at here, Vincent Ferrer, was infamous, I would say, for his enthusiasm for forced conversions in the early 1400s in Spain. The situation changed pretty significantly in the 1490s. In 1492, Spain gave its Jewish population an ultimatum to convert or to leave. And I think Isabel and Ferdinand might have been a little bit surprised at the number of Jews who actually chose to leave rather than stay and convert. And we're looking at the map here. You can see that some of those folks traveled in stages across Europe. Some of them ended up in, as we can see, in northern France, in the Netherlands, in Italy. Others traveled south to North Africa, and in some cases ended up even in the Middle East, in what was then the Ottoman Empire, in places like Safed, Sfat. Some Spanish Jews traveled to Portugal because they had family contacts. It was a close cultural ties as well. But only 5 years later, the King of Portugal made a similar decision, only in his case, he forced the entire Jewish population to the port in Lisbon. We're looking at a tower near that port. They stayed there for months, and then he decided that he would forcibly convert all of them, but give them a generation's grace period before they started to be tried by the Inquisition. Some of those Jews who had fled to Portugal at that point gave up and came back to Spain. Some went to a bit of what's now northern Spain called Navarre, which expelled its Jews in 1499. Fairly quickly then, although in Portugal, converted Jews had a bit of a grace period. In Spain, the trials began even before the expulsion in the 1480s, and those trials were particularly intense. We had a huge amount of pressure from the Inquisition, focusing specifically on women. And what we can see in these early trials from the 1480s, the 1490s, the early 1500s, is that women often worked together to defend themselves. They were in the inquisitorial prisons together. They would share information about what seemed to work, how they could defend themselves. They clearly were sharing strategies, sharing ideas, trying to protect themselves. We can also see a lot of evidence of women they were forced to name accomplices. They would name accomplices of people who were out of town or in some other way out of reach of the inquisitors. They would put all the families Judaizing, all their Jewish practices, blame on themselves, trying to protect their children, things like that. And that kind of theme of individual and collective resistance is a theme we'll see all through this history. We also see a lot of family conflict, and that's another theme that continues throughout this period. Sometimes pre-existing family conflicts between mothers and daughters in particular plays out in Inquisition trials. And that is something we'll see in many of the people I'll talk about today. This is a trial of a woman from 1485. And that is Spanish, even if it doesn't look like Spanish to you. After that kind of basic overview, I wanted to now dive in and talk about these three women in particular who I think are so interesting and important. And the first of them is named Benvenita Abravanel. Although we can trace her through the records and we know a bit more about her than we do many converso women, new Christian women, there are frustrating gaps in our knowledge. We know she was born somewhere in Spain. We're not entirely sure where. We're not entirely sure when. But we do know she was part of an enormously learned and wealthy family, the Abravanel family. They fled Spain in 1492. Her uncle Isaac was born in 1437, and so that kind of gives us a time frame in which she was operating. It seems that in 1492, the family fled Spain rather than convert, and they settled for a little while in Portugal. During that time that the family, the kind of extended family, was in Portugal, she married her cousin, Isaac's son, Samuel. We also know that she and her daughter at this time both developed a strong reputation for their Jewish practice, their devotion to Judaism, their participation in regular fasts, for example. Eventually, Benvenita and her extended family relocate to Naples in southern Italy. And at this point, Naples was actually under the control of Ferdinand and Isabella, but all of their realms had separate rules. And so even though Jews had been kicked out of Spain, they were still permitted to live in Naples. So they took their wealth, their influence, their knowledge, their learning, and they relocated to the southern Italian peninsula, where Benvenita and her family became super important politically and economically and socially. Her uncle served at the royal court, and Benvenita also was a very important figure at court. She educated and mentored the woman that we're looking at here, Eleonora de Toledo. Eleonora was the daughter of the Spanish viceroy. And Benvenita and Eleonora exchanged letters for years, and it looks like Benvenita was Eleonora's teacher. But eventually, the religious devotion and affiliation of this family made it difficult for them to stay in Naples. They were known, Benvenita in particular, but the rest of her family as well, was known for their charitable works. They were known for, again, their fasting. Her male relatives were leaders of the Jewish community, and in many ways they emphasized their Jewishness in their public statements, even in the way that they signed documents. Benvenita and her husband were quite close as well. They seem to have had a very trusting relationship because Samuel named Benvenita, his wife, as his heir, which was pretty atypical to name a woman as your heir. And not only was she his heir, but he gave her oversight over who the children could marry. She could withhold their inheritance if she didn't approve of their marriages. She also had oversight over the family business. She was fiercely protective of her family and its reputation, another kind of indication of her heroism. Eventually, they relocate from Naples to Ferrara. And when we look at this map, we can see, again, this is showing us the movement of Jews, and from many of them, immigrants from Spain, up from Sicily and Naples to somewhat more comfortable places to live, politically comfortable places to live, the Papal States, Tuscany, Florence, Venice, and in Benvenita's case, and her family's case, Ferrara. Because the situation in Naples was unsafe, they chose to stay there, but they continued to maintain relationships with some of the contacts they had made at court in Naples. It seems like Eleonora's father protected them at one point, and when they relocate to Ferrara, Eleonora and Benvenita continued to be in contact with one another. That's also helpful as Benvenita continues to stand up for herself and to protect what she sees as the Jewish obligations, responsibilities to the community against even her own child. And against Doña Gracia Nasi, they sort of came into conflict, those two women, when they were both in Ferrara together. She also was not super supportive of those Spanish Jews who had converted to Christianity and then showed up in Ferrara and were kind of returning to Judaism. She was continuing to advocate for her family's interests even as late as the 1560s, so far as we can tell. We don't know when she died either. But her advocacy for Judaism and for her family were in the face of some significant struggles, were a real example of heroism, and a really someone who deserves to be much better known. The second person that I wanted to talk about, as I said, lived in a very different part of the world. And I'd like us to think about a little bit about the global extent of the conversos, the crypto-Jews who emigrated from Spain and Portugal all the way across the world through the Spanish and Portuguese empires. By the middle of the 16th century, even so then, that is to say, by the middle of the 1500s, Sephardic Jewish families had formed commercial enterprises, mercantile empires, and those trade networks extended across the Mediterranean into the Middle East. They also extended across the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to Mexico. They even stretched across the Pacific to the island of Goa off the coast of India and into the Philippines. So we had inquisitors trying to track Jewish men and women from continent to continent, and family members as well. Once again, these family groups sometimes included a mix of people, a mix of committed Christians and very committed crypto-Jews. That is, families that were practicing Judaism in secret, families who were opposed to practicing Judaism in secret. They also seem to have included a number of family members whose religious beliefs could be a little bit more malleable, and sort of went with the flow of whatever was customary wherever they happened to be living. It also was pretty typical for these families to move a lot more than we imagined people moved. We sort of, in the 1600s, we kind of picture people staying at home, not getting more than 5-10 miles from where they grew up. Many of these conversos traveled thousands of miles in their lives. Just incredibly adventurous and enterprising people, and doing that in part to protect themselves, to protect their families, and to protect their faiths. In some places, as in Brazil, converso families would travel from Spain to the Netherlands, and then from the Netherlands to Brazil when the Dutch temporarily attacked and tried to control part of Brazil. I showed you an example. The Inquisition operated in Brazil as well. I'm showing you a cover of a book here. And in a little bit, Dr. Eletan Medeiros will tell us a little bit about Branca Dias, one of the converso women that we know about in Brazil. So just something to kind of look forward to as we move through our talks today. Some conversos intentionally chose to settle in remote areas of the Spanish Empire, specifically to avoid the attention of the authorities. to avoid the attention of the Inquisition. The Society of Crypto-Judaic Studies, one of the sponsors of this talk, does a tremendous job researching and documenting those people's lives. So that's really, that's important to know about as well. And I think Edith Scott at the end will be talking about her family in Panama and giving us a little bit more sense of some of that work as well. One particularly important family in this process was the Carvajal family. And I especially wanted to talk about Isabel de Carvajal today. The Carvajal family included a long and again, elite lineage, and at its heart were two intertwined clans with multiple intermarriages, a conversa family and then a so-called old Christian family, that is families that had never been Jewish in Spain. The Santa Maria family, a name they took when they converted from Judaism to Christianity, and the Carvajal family. And together, those families rose to become vitally important in political circles, in church governance. Roger Martinez's book talks quite a bit about this, and Dr. Schneegert will be telling us a little bit more about the Carvajals later on. Isabel and her family were less central to the Carvajal family than others, but they did attempt to rely on some of those family members for assistance, including their uncle, who was a governor of one of the provinces of northern Mexico. Isabel herself traveled with her parents and 7 of her 8 siblings to Mexico in 1579 or 80 when she was about 21 years old. Her parents had not told their children that they were secretly practicing Judaism. That was pretty typical. And some children they told different children at different ages. So some of their children didn't know that they were crypto-Jews actually until those children had reached adulthood. Isabel and her brother Luis seem to have learned when they were teens, and both Isabel and some of her siblings became very devoted in the practice of Judaism. Isabel in particular, along with her brother Luis, developed a strong reputation for piety. And Isabel in particular actually tried to convert other conversos, other people whose families had converted from Judaism to Christianity now, even 3 or 4 generations earlier, to come back to Judaism. The family traveled to Mexico. They attempted to live in a part of northern Leon under the protection of their uncle, who was the governor. But the expedition came at a very difficult time, and the territory was quite harsh. Before they left, Isabel's aunt asked Isabel in particular to try and convert her uncle, the governor. Isabel's aunt wasn't going to go. She stayed back in Iberia, but Isabel's uncle, the governor, was leaving with the family, and the aunt asked Isabel to try and convince him to leave Catholicism and be a practicing Jew once they were at the borders of the empire. She was quite intelligent, very well educated. She was lovely. Her husband died relatively young. And she seemed, because of her piety, she seemed like a good choice to try and convert other family members, but it did not go well. When she tried to convince her uncle to practice Judaism, what he told the inquisitors was that he hit her so hard that he knocked her against a wall and told her he would never hear of it. He did not, however, denounce her to the Inquisition, which he should have done. She also attempted to convert her second husband to practicing Judaism. He was another converso, another descendant of Jewish converts. Her second husband also refused to practice Judaism, but he did denounce her to the Inquisition. And once again, we see this kind of family conflict where different family members take very different approaches, and it's Jewish women and conversa women, crypto-Jewish women, who get caught in the middle. As a result, Isabel was denounced, was imprisoned, her entire family was imprisoned as well. Her father had already died, but her mother, her sisters, some of them still relatively young, and her brother Luis were all brought before the Mexican Inquisition in 1590. All of them were tried and tortured. And eventually, however, they were found, the picture is an 18th century image from the cover of my book. In the end, they were found what was called partially guilty in 1590. That meant that they had to perform Catholic penance. They had to give up all of their funds to the Inquisition. They were sentenced to house arrest. The women were sentenced to house arrest, and the brother Luis, initially, after being in house arrest for a while, they had him working in a hospital and then eventually teaching in a school run by monks. After a few years, they paid another fine. They seemed like they had behaved relatively well, and so they were pardoned in 1593. This isn't actually very uncommon. Sentences of perpetual imprisonment often only last a few years. So this is pretty typical. Having to pay an extra fine, a little bit less common, but they had a number actually of non-converso friends and allies in Mexico who loaned them the money to be able to pay that fine. Also, the Mexican Inquisition kind of played fast and loose with the rules a little bit. So the fact that they were extracting more money isn't a big surprise. It seems like that pardon would make for a happy ending, but unfortunately that was not to be. Luis and Isabel was kind of contained still with the family. They weren't allowed out very much. Luis did continue to attempt to convert other conversos to the active practice of Judaism. One of the men that he tried to convert denounced him a second time to the inquisitors in 1595. The entire family, Isabel, Luis, their mother, and their sisters were all imprisoned and tried a second time. They were now seen as extra dangerous because they had, according to the inquisitors, relapsed and were trying to convert people again. This also meant that they were dogmatizing, in the language of the inquisitors. They were trying, not only were they heretics, according to the Catholic Church, but teaching other people to practice heresy. This was a much more serious accusation. The Inquisition was so concerned about all of the family members, Luis and his sisters, that they put spies in the cells who pretended to be fellow prisoners and then reported back to the inquisitors about what they were saying within their prison cells. They also would have Inquisition staffers listen outside the doors of the Inquisition cells to see what they were saying. Luis and his sisters tried to communicate back and forth while they were in prison. Eventually they got access to paper, but before that, Isabel or maybe one of her sisters would write, like, scratch onto a banana peel little notes to Luis, and Luis would reply by scratching notes onto eggshells and avocado pits. The reason we know that, of course, is that the Inquisition found all of that material as well, confiscated it, and included it in the trial record. At this second trial, the family was found guilty, and they and many of their friends and colleagues were executed in 1596. And we're looking at an example of what that sort of execution at a ritual ceremony called the auto de fe, what that would look like. Isabel and her family certainly qualify as heroines, heroes, and even, I think we could say, martyrs to the faith that they not only preserved, but actively promoted among fellow conversos. Finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about one last converso woman who I think is quite interesting. When the Carvajal family were tried in Mexico, this eventually became part of a worldwide prosecution of conversos in the 1630s and 40s and 50s. For many new Christians, for many conversos, it was quite dangerous, but not everyone suffered a fate as grim as Isabel de Carvajal. Prosecutions in the 17th century were not as violent, not as intense as they were in that very early period around the time of the expulsion. And it was difficult, but not impossible to defend yourself. In a few cases, if you had money and you had education, you could find your way to success, even against the Inquisition. And Menthia de Almeida is a great example of that. Her son was critically involved in the tobacco trade, and she herself was highly educated. They were well connected at court. She was very well prepared when a familiar of the Holy Office showed up to arrest her. She immediately pulled out papers, letters guaranteeing safe conduct from the King of England, the King of France, hand-signed by them. They're in her Inquisition trial in 1654. Once she was inside the prison, she couldn't communicate with her son outside of the prison, nor could he get letters inside to her. But each of them independently worked to use the resources of the Inquisition against itself. They used a number of different defense strategies, again, without ever communicating directly. It's incredibly impressive what they were able to accomplish. And her trial record is, it's like an inch and a half thick if you go to the archives in Madrid to take a look at it. The first thing her son did was he started writing letters. He wanted to know who was the best defense attorney. Inquisitors always gave the people they tried a defense attorney. They wanted the strongest one. They made great use of character witnesses, which was one of the best ways to defend yourself in an Inquisition trial. And they found many, many people who would speak in Menthia's defense. They also used a very specific legal tactic of challenging prosecution witnesses. And then if they were seen to have a grudge or ill will, then that prosecution testimony didn't count. And they made great use of that. Her son appealed the use of torture and argued, because of his mother's age, that she shouldn't be tortured, and they succeeded in that as well. I talk about this trial a little bit more in the book I have coming out soon. Menthia's case, in fact, she was given only light penance. She basically was let go. Her situation gives us a sense of the kind of ambiguity of converso life in the 1600s. First of all, the shifting religious practices in different locations. There are a number of witnesses who speak against her, but they don't have a lot very concrete to say. It's not clear how devout a practice of Judaism she had, or if she even had a practice of Judaism, or if this was a politically motivated arrest. Also, we can see in Menthia's case the importance of having kind of a Spanish or Portuguese identity wherever they traveled, that even more than, or at least as much as the practice of Judaism, was this sense that you were a Spaniard, a Portuguese, someone who had converted from Judaism, and wherever you went, that kind of collective social identity was the most important thing about them. In the end, that was what attracted the Inquisition's notice. Also, Portuguese trials versus Spanish trials. A lot of the evidence against Menthia came from the Portuguese Inquisition, which was much harsher than the Spanish Inquisition, and often pitted family members against each other. Her brother was a key witness in his own trial against his sister Menthia. And the Portuguese inquisitors wrote that up, sent it to Spain. They kept those documents for years until they eventually arrested her. And that too shows this kind of consistent suspicion from outsiders that conversos got, no matter what they did or how they behaved. And that's part of what we're seeing here in Menthia's case as well. But it is a more positive case too, because she manages to get off. It's a much happier way to end a discussion of conversa heroines, I think. there are a few key points I'd like us to remember and take away as we're thinking about these women. The first is that even in incredibly dark moments, we can see the strength and resilience that these Conversa heroines demonstrated, even in the face of living in inquisitorial prisons, even in the face of harassment from their own family members, right? They continue to exemplify a kind of strength and commitment that's incredibly impressive to me as a historian. They're also demonstrating the way in which there are some things worth standing up for, no matter the cost. And all three of these women, although some of them managed to defend and protect themselves and their families better than others are able to, are facing, some face more or greater hostility. They all pay a cost, and yet they all are making that commitment and serving as examples as well in many of these cases for their children, for their daughters and their sons. Finally, we see in Benvenita, Isabel, and Menthia, and so many others like them, that they were heroic precisely because their lives were complicated, because they didn't live in a world of simple black and white choices, because faith and family and community could pull them in multiple different directions. And it was in the face of those conflicting and difficult choices that they found this strength to persevere and stand forward and be resilient at whatever life threw them. I think it's wonderful to be able to think about these women. Thank you for giving me a chance to share their lives with you.
Thank you, Gretchen, very much. I'll introduce our next speaker. Just a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, we will have a Q&A session after the presenters have gone, so please stay tuned if you're interested to ask the presenters more detailed questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Mark A. Schneegert, who is an educator, scientist, entrepreneur, and author of over 80 publications, including anthology of the religious poetry from the Mexican Inquisition trials of 16th century crypto-Jews, which includes the stirring poems written by the sisters of the famous martyr Luis de Carvajal el Mozo, or the Younger, preserved for centuries in inquisitorial records. They have now been released in English for the very first time. Mark, take it away.
Hi, thanks for having me today. It's really a pleasure to come and tell you a little bit more about the Carvajals. Gretchen gave a great introduction that leads into some of the story that I'm going to tell today. So the Carvajal family were notorious dogmatizers, Judaizers that tried to spread Judaism in the New World. And eventually they were given paper, they were educated individuals. And these are some of the writings of Luis de Carvajal, which were recovered after being stolen just a few years ago and displayed and are now at the University of Pennsylvania. So there are the members of the family, as Gretchen was suggesting. Luis de Carvajal el Mozo, the Younger, is the nephew of the governor, Luis de Carvajal, and was brought over with a number of his family members. When we look at their tradition, when we look at their religious traditions and their liturgical poems and writings, many of these appear in the trials of his sisters. Leonora, Isabel, Mariana, Anna, and others, as well as other members of the clan and family. So here's just some classic pictures of Isabel de Carvajal. And perhaps Isabel or Francesca, they were subject to terrible torture. And during this time, the inquisitors took scrupulous notes of everything they said. And eventually, many of them were burned. Here is the younger sister of Luis that was too young at the time to be prosecuted, but later was. So there are writings available from their trials. The transcripts are quite detailed and very long. Thousands of pages of trials are available. This one is from Luis's grandniece, which I was fortunate to be able to examine at the Huntington Library and Museum in Pasadena. These documents are single copy documents spread throughout the world, many of them in the United States, most of them in special collections. So they were kind of hidden and at risk of being either lost or forgotten. I looked at the trials of Leonora and Isabel, which are housed at the Bancroft Library at University of California, Berkeley. And I tried to pull out the prayers and the poems, the canticos, the songs that are embedded in these trials. The inquisitors made them sing the songs and made them say the prayers. And mainly they're fragmentary, but some of them are quite long, more than 2 or 3 verses. Some of them go for several pages. Lewis's trial was published in Spanish in 1935, but most of these documents really are not available and have not been translated into English before. So I collected these over several years, compiled them, and have translated them into English, mainly to proliferate the words of these martyrs. And as Gretchen said, it is absolutely remarkable how hopeful their writings are, given the life that they were living at that time and the terrible suffering that they were experiencing. Many of their prayers, of course, are penitential. There's many prayers of asking for forgiveness for their sin, knowing that Hashem will eventually save them and show them favor if they follow the laws of Moses. So this is throughout their writings, and there's several dozen of these fragments and poems in the book that I show here. Let me just share a few with you. So here is one in a series of 9 songs that are most famous, the canticos. And these have appeared in Spanish, some of them, all of them in Lewis's trial. These happen to come from Leonor's trial, and that's where that image is from. And I'll save you the Spanish, and I'll just read the English translation. How pleasant it is, how delightful, much more than anyone knows to imagine, to follow this glorious path whereby God commands us to walk. The whole law of God is very pleasant, and he who dares to blaspheme, cursed will they be in that life where there is no certain time nor measure. To me, I hear so many different threads in a poem like this. I think about what a life with no certain time and measure might be like, and I'm thinking someone who doesn't follow the laws of Moses, who doesn't know when the holidays are, who doesn't know when it's Shabbat, who doesn't have the rules and the practices that we might see. But you can read into these what you want. It's poetry. The next one I'll show is Cantico number 7. This is also the first translation of this particular poem. Because my Lord gives you pleasing new songs, as making new works every day, there in the city of thy saints, I will praise your name every day. End our mighty weeping and gather us unto your holy company, and do not give us as we deserve, because we trust in you. This type of theme runs through many of their poems. Many of their poems are associated with Yom Kippur and the holiday season, and lots of penitential asking for favor, realizing that they've been cut off from Hashem and the light, and this is why they're suffering. I'll leave you with one last poem, a short one, which is well known, but it speaks a little bit to their suffering at that time. And it has great calligraphy with it in the trials that I've seen associated. I said with great pain, alas, that in the midst of my days, I went back to the grim gates of this prison for my error and my iniquities, and so forth. All of these are fragments. They're all pieces of longer pieces. The collection that I have gathered in anthology is the most comprehensive to date, but there are other materials that are available. I've not seen all of the materials in Mexico City and other places. And where did these poems come from? Who wrote them? Many attribute them to Luis de Carvajal. Many attribute them to a family friend, a physician. And these poems, many of them came from Portugal. The physician's father-in-law was burned at the stake in Lisbon reciting songs and prayers like this. So a lot of this tradition are things that they were carrying with them for 100 years and brought with them to Mexico. They're wonderful, they're warm, and there's something there to teach us. These are the words of martyrs from 400 years ago, and I'm glad I was able to share them with you. I hope you'll take a look at some of the other materials and enjoy these and recognize them and respect them as I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eliton Souto de Medeiros, who graduated from the Federal University of Paraíba in Brazil. He is a descendant of Branca Dias, one of the numerous crypto-Jewish heroines sought by the Inquisition across continents and oceans, and he brings his passionate, in-depth research of his remarkable ancestral legacy to our event today. Eliton?
Hello, everyone. My name is Eliton Medeiros. I'm not a scholar like those of who have presented before, but I'm a university professor. I'm a material scientist, and I'll talk about Branca Dias, which is basically the research I've been done during the past 10 or 15 years during my free time. Well, Gretchen and Mark have already presented a very interesting presentation about, the Portuguese and Jews in Spain and Portugal. In 1500, when the Portuguese discovered Brazil, they started bringing the first exiled people to Brazil because of crimes such as Judaism. Only 34 years after the discovery of the country, that's when the Portuguese decided to conquer the land and create sugar mills. So what they did is they split the land in huge land grants called capitanias or captaincies. And the first and the most successful was given to Duarte Coelho Pereira, who was also a Jew. Okay, so most of the settlers who came to work in the sugar mills were crypto-Jews. So that's when they founded places like Recife, Olinda, Igaraçu, Goiânia. Today you can still see these old sugar mills and beautiful houses around the state of Pernambuco and Paraíba. So in 1593, the first inquisitor called Heitor Furtado de Mendonça comes to visit Brazil and spent 3 years where they gathered a lot of denunciations and confession through several villages in the Capitania of Pernambuco and Paraíba. So in Brazil, they collect about 3 written books with denunciations, and these denunciations were in 1980s, written and published in Portuguese. So it's from these books that we can recover the Jewish life in colonial Brazil between 1530s to 1600s. So where they talk about the tradition, about the families, businesses, what they did, the relationship between them. So most of these denunciations are related to Branca Dias and Diogo Fernandes, okay? So like they said that before Shabbat, they would take shower, they would dress the best dresses, they would clean their house. And the interesting thing here is that they would light 2 lamp wicks, which is not 2 candles because they could not have candles on Friday evenings. They also would cook special meals. They would read the Torah with the daughters, and they would have parties throughout the Jewish calendar. So Diogo Fernandes also, which is Branca Dias' husband, it said that when he died, he avoided looking at the cross that the wife of the captain of the Capitania tried to present to him before he died, but he didn't look at the cross. So these are the main denounces. So who is then Branca Dias? Branca Dias actually was born in Portugal around 1515. She married Diogo Fernandes, who was her cousin against her mother's wishes. That gives a lot of trouble for her. In Vienna, they actually owned a fabric shop, and Diogo Fernandes was a merchant where he would sell things in Azores and Madeira Islands. So in 1542, Diogo Fernandes received a land grant in Pernambuco in a place called Camaragibe, where people say later on that he fled to Brazil because of the Inquisition. Actually, a year later, after he receives his land grant, Branca Dias was in prison, which is actually said that she was denounced by her mother and sister. 3 years later, she was sentenced to use a San Benito and a few years in jail. But then she says, she writes a letter, and then she was released for some reason. I can tell you that Dr. Gretchen already explained that these people, although they were sentenced sometimes to life in prison, but a few years later, they would be released. So in this meantime, she writes a letter to the Holy Office asking to be released from using the San Benito because she had 7 little children and she needed to work. And with wearing the San Benito, she did not find a job. So she was then released. But then a few years later, she appears in Brazil, and the denunciations say that she fled from Portugal, and some people said that she was sentenced and exiled by Inquisition. Well, we can't find any documents proving that she was exiled. What's probably correct is that she left Portugal from Vienna. She was actually from Vienna, and all the relationship between the Portuguese and the people from Pernambuco, like trades and everything, was done through Vienna. So that's probably when she came to Brazil. So in Portugal, they had 7 kids. One of them was armless. So, and it's said that he would write with his feet, which is very interesting because it proves that even with a person disabled like him, they were able to write and to read, which is very uncommon for people of his time. And they also had 4 more siblings in Brazil. Well, the genealogists 200 years later say that the good thing about Branca Dias and Diogo Fernandes is that there is no seed of them in this land. That makes me remember the Menthia stele, where they say that the Israel is no longer, it's a parallel between the Israeli and the Egyptian, and this almost 200,000 years later. In Brazil, when she got here, she had a 2-story house in Olinda, which is very next to the church, the main church of Olinda. And Jews would gather, and even Jews coming from Portugal would gather in her house for prayers and to read the Torah. It's been said that her house in Pernambuco actually was the first synagogue in the Americas. Well, that's a location of her house, which is very close to the church, and it's very beneath the protection of the Holy Church. So some of these enunciations say that during the first new moon in August or September, they would just retire, not retire, they would just take whatever their belongings they had and go to Camaragibe, which was about 2 miles from Olinda, and just stay for sometimes 2 or 3 months. And it's said that a lot of people would follow during these Jewish festivities, would just go there. And many people say that they did have a synagogue in Camaragibe as well. So she was the first teacher in Brazil, and then she was denounced, but when the church came, she had already died. They took her bones to be burned at stake, but her kids and grandchildren were persecuted. So one of them said that she was descendant of the Colonial family, which makes her close relative to Abraham Senior, was the last crown rabbi of Castile. And today, I would estimate to be 500,000 of Branca Dias descendants in Brazil, including myself. We have some of books been published and about Branca Dias. I myself wrote this about 1,400 pages about her and her descendants, including the first volume, which is basically about the traditions we still keep today. And some of the descendants of Branca Dias and many of the colonial Jews in Pernambuco are being gathered by the Synagogue Without Borders, which is run by Rabbi and Rabbanit Ventura. We still have the first synagogues in the Americas, which is in Recife. For the ones who left the synagogue went to New York, New Amsterdam, and founded the New York Synagogue. So I'd like to thank Michael Steinberg and Jewish Heritage Alliance, as well as the Synagogue Without Borders, and those of you who are watching, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliton. So last but not least, I have the honor to turn it over to Edith Scott Saavedra, our final presenter. She earned a Bachelor of Arts magna cum laude from Harvard University and a Juris Doctor cum laude from Harvard Law School. She has had a distinguished career as an international lawyer, business consultant, and author. A descendant of conversos, she wrote The Lamps of Albarracin, a fictional first-person narrative by a Sephardic girl that recounts the arrival of the Spanish Inquisition into the Kingdom of Aragon in the 1480s. Edith, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Isaac. We've heard great presentations just now at the historical level, and now for the personal level. I'm going to tell my story, hoping it inspires the audience, on your personal journeys. When I was young in Washington, D.C. In the 1970s, I didn't know much about my mother's childhood in the Republic of Panama. She said she was Catholic. She didn't go to Mass and she didn't talk about it. But she did talk when we were in the car about cemeteries. Each time we passed a cemetery, she'd pass judgment on it. In particular, while driving down Rock Creek Parkway in Washington, D.C., just along that cemetery, my mother gave it low marks. This cemetery is terrible. Just look at those monuments crowded so close together and the brown earth. And one weekend she finally saw a cemetery she liked out in the countryside. She said, look at that cemetery. It's just how a cemetery should be, in the countryside, in a green meadow, in fresh soil, newly broken. Well, I was a daughter who listened to our mother. And when I reached puberty, I was in for an earful, like rules of feminine hygiene and lots of don'ts regarding intimacy. No do's and don'ts, just don'ts. Intricate rules. She also searched my dresser drawers. Now, this didn't make sense to me. I mean, growing up in the nation's capital in the 1970s. I went to Harvard Radcliffe. On holidays, I'd come home and my mother would say, you think because you go to Harvard, you're so smart? I tell you, every person who's alive on this planet can do something better than you can. Every person has something to teach you. And if I was feeling unsure of myself, she'd say, if you are not for yourself, who's going to be for you? Now, once she opened up about her childhood, when she was a girl in the 1920s, in a town in rural Panama, she used to spend time inside the house with the old grandmothers. And they'd always say, in Spain, we were members of the royal court. Our walls were made of cedar wood and hung with Flemish tapestries. Then all was lost. Well, my mother turned to me, there were tears in her eyes, and I knew those tears weren't about money. They had to be about family, identity. And I thought, this is simple, straightforward. Widener Library at Harvard has compendia of all of the leading families in Iberia. I'll look us up. Well, guess what? Our names were not in those books. So it would be decades later, after my mother's death, the rise of the internet, that I'd find a website put up by Harry Stein listing Sephardic surnames. And I found all of our surnames. And then it was my time to cry. Also, when I read Secrecy and Deceit by David Gitlitz of blessed memory, the testimony given before the Inquisition, cemeteries should be a virgin earth, never before struck or turned. The very same rules of feminine hygiene and intimacy that my mom taught me. And the sayings, who is wise? He who learns from every man, Ben Soma. And if I am not for myself, who shall be for me? Hillel. Gratitude, that was the one virtue that she taught me, not the Catholic virtues. She always taught me gratitude was the most important and the most difficult of the virtues. Well, it's the foundation of Jewish prayer. And then, of course, the family tree DNA results, which came back, your homeland is Israel. So for my own personal journey, I wondered, what would it have been like to have been a Jewish girl coming of age in Spain in those precious final years before the expulsion of the Jews? I decided to go back in time, my own personal journey, right? And become that girl. I'd tell her story in the first person from a young girl's point of view, and that became my novel, The Lamps of Albarracin, in Spanish, Los Candiles de Albarracin. Now, I was living in Singapore, the Republic of Singapore at the time, and I was working on my manuscripts, plural, because I was writing the English and also revising the Spanish translation, preparing for a joint two-language launch. And when I was partway through in May 2016, I received a surprise diagnosis from my doctor of stage 4 incurable cancer. Yeah, my life, my kids, my novel. And the diagnosis was right. It's a cancer with no cure. So I kept working on this book, you know, to tell a story about Sephardic women, about a heroine, about resistance, through 2 complete rounds of platinum chemo. Inspired, you know, I was inspired for some reason by the book of Isaiah, and in particular, Isaiah 54:11. Its foundations shall be sapphires, its walls shall be of precious stones. And in 2019, my novel was published in English and Spanish by Floricanto Press, and it's The Lamps of Albarracin, and here we have it that's the English, and Los Candiles de Albarracin in the Spanish. You know, when I was feeling really sick from cisplatin, gemcitabine, carboplatin, and Taxol, there were times when I couldn't write. And I'd close my eyes and I'd imagine a beautiful portrait for the cover. I'd imagine the portrait of a Sephardic girl that would have been painted if the Inquisition hadn't gotten in the way. And I'm really proud that I was able to design it and commission it, even the gown and the oil lamp for Shabbat, which you'll see on the cover. The novel, set in Spain, tells the story of a girl who comes of age in the 1480s in the kingdom of Aragon, when the Inquisition arrives. We experience the heritage of the Spanish Sephardim in Spain at the beginning of the Renaissance. You know, the great thinkers, the synagogues, poetry and ballads, arts and crafts, ceramics, festivals, recipes. The patrimony was splendid. And not only in the famous cities, but also in the towns and villages where most people lived. And we learned the actual impact of the arrival of the Inquisition, and we learn about a history, a true story, of a remarkable heroine of resistance, the historical figure, Brianda Besante de Santangel. Brianda was baptized Catholic at birth, yet remained an observant Jew and became an important leader. She was actually known as La Rabbina. She conducted Jewish religious services for converso women and girls and taught them in her own house, and she gave up her life for the cause. My purpose is to preserve and communicate our precious Sephardic heritage, including resistance, memory, our women and girls, our heroines. Remember Isaiah 54:11, its foundations shall be sapphires, refers, according to commentators, to the education of the future children of the nation of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith. I'd like to turn it back to Michael Steinberger, founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, for his closing remarks.
In closing, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for an amazing presentation and our audience for your interest and participation in our programs. We thank those of you who have contributed to our efforts by donations and/or other forms of assistance. We ask everyone here today to please get involved by taking part and making a difference, be it via helping to fund our programs and/or any other form of help you deem comfortable. For those that wish to make a donation, you can do so at www.jewishheritagealliance.com/donate, or in any fashion you deem comfortable. Finally, be on the lookout for our next Sefarad educational webinar planned for December 12th, 2021. We will also be announcing the launch of several major events planned for 2022 and 2023. Stay tuned. We will be sending you an email announcement with details and registration information. Please follow us on social media and on our website at www.jewishheritagealliance.com. Thank you for making this event a success. See you next time.